Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Meet the Maker event for Asian American Stories of Resilience and Beyond. My name is Lailanie Gadia. I'm the Operations Director of the Asian American Documentary Network. We are a network of over 1,300 members working to increase the visibility and support of Asian Americans in the documentary field. And I'm excited today to spotlight our stories. And we started this storytelling initiative in 2020 in response to the pandemic and an increase in anti-Asian sentiments to share stories from our diverse communities. And we're extremely proud to co-produce this series with World Channel, who have been supportive of our filmmakers and stories, and to have the support from the Center for Asian American Media, especially for this latest series, Asian American Stories of Resilience and Beyond, which are 7 shorts that move beyond the pandemic and reflect the complexities of Asian American experiences in this critical moment. And thank you to World Channel for hosting this event. And before we get started, let's watch the series trailer.
When I looked at the archival, it was always really hard to watch that because that's how I remember my dad.
Everyone that I've grown up with and love is at risk of being attacked or killed.
Our country is still in this place where we have this conversation about Black versus white versus Latino versus Asian versus Indigenous. We forget that so many of these communities are intermixed.
And here's Lonnie riding the pine, collecting splinters again.
It's heavy, Dad.
What?
These are also American stories. These are also human stories, and they're all relatable in my eyes.
Intentional unit, there is only one shooter, gunshot wound to the head. He is down.
I felt an affinity for this story.
There's no protocol for these things. I don't know what to do.
The Punjabi Sikh community is very strong. There's so many ways people have been resilient coming together.
Life है strong होके जीनी पैंदी है.
There is a narrative of resilience with refugees and immigrants. They're the bearers of all this historical trauma, and they somehow magically get through it. And so I wanted to honor the resilience, but not idealize my mom's struggle.
There were so many times I really didn't want to make this film.
Hi, Dad. Dad, are you tired?
This hits in a different way when you are an Asian woman, and if you know what those sort of responsibilities can be like to care for folks in your family.
This is not my dad. This is not how he normally is. So he has COVID, right? Are there priests to pray for my dad? Have someone pray for my dad since we can't be there?
Those narratives, those ancestors' voices, our families' voices are critical to preserving who we are, and those stories need to be told.
There are just so many hard topics and hard experiences that do need to be shared. The exchange to me is bringing down the wall of saving face to hopefully open up the conversation and make change.
I haven't seen my mom since 98, I believe. Last time was behind glass. Oh, Mom is here.
I'm the 4th generation of my family in Hawaii, and my mom's side is Chinese, and my dad's side is Filipino.
So I'm California born and raised, half Korean and half white American.
I was born in London.
I'm the eldest daughter. Both my parents immigrated from the Philippines.
Voila. My dad is Afro-Puerto Rican, and then my mom is Native Hawaiian, Polynesian, Filipino. It makes it so hard to relate to people sometimes, but then at the same time, you can relate to so many people.
Everyone's point of view is special. I think the more we have slight nuances of difference, the more we can really understand our society.
Uh, I would love to welcome all the filmmakers and would love for you all to introduce yourselves.
Well, I could get started. Yeah. So my name is Frances Rubio. I go by Frankie, and I am the eldest daughter of immigrant Filipino parents. And I am the director and producer of recording for Dodi. And I am a documentary and narrative filmmaker, as well as a film marketer.
Hey everyone, my name is Joua Lee Grande, and I'm a documentary filmmaker based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, on Dakota land. And my film is on all fronts. Yeah, I don't know what else to share, but I do primarily documentary films out of the Midwest.
I'm JP Dobrin. I'm a filmmaker based in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I made The Lookout about Champ and Bun.
Hi there. My name is Quyên Nguyen-Le. I directed In Living Memory about the closure of my mother's nail salon and what it meant to our family. Thanks for having us.
Hey, welcome. And so I'm so glad that we're all here. Thank you for being here for this conversation. And, it's been a year since our stories were released digitally, and many of us were together in person to screen all 7 shorts at last year's Los Angeles Asian Pacific Film Festival. And so, the series is rich with so many topics and themes. And for today, I want to focus on 3 topics: mental health, family, and identity, and documenting our stories. And throughout today, we'll share a 30-second clip from several of the shorts at the top of each topic. And so the first topic, with May also being Mental Health Awareness Month, I'd like to start off with, topic of mental health. And I want to share a recording for Dodi by Frankie Rubio. And so let's watch that clip.
I think one of the hardest things to really grapple with was even sharing this story.
Dad.
I think even now I'm nervous. I thought about possible employers who might want to hire me and look me up. I didn't want my friends to see me in a way that they might have never seen me before.
See what I can do.
Can you see us?
I personally really want to change the way in which we think about caregiving in America.
It's so good to see you, Dad.
And so with that clip, I actually want to first direct a question to Frankie. And, Frankie, at the end of that clip, you shared about wanting to change how people see caregiving. And can you share more about that?
Yeah, I actually haven't seen that film in over a year. And since it was released, my dad actually passed away on the 10th of last year. So it's really hard for me to watch. And I still can't really, I know it's screened at a couple of film festivals and I can't really be there to watch it just because I've just been trying to heal. And so I'm sorry, Lailanie, I'm like trying to think about the question. But yeah, when it comes to caregiving, I became a caregiver at 28, 29 when my dad first got sick. And at the time, my parents were divorced and I'm the eldest daughter. And so in a time when all my friends were getting married and moving in together and having kids, I had no blueprint for understanding how to navigate the healthcare system, how to understand Medicare, how to, do not resuscitate is a form that you fill out and you have to decide the life trajectory of someone. And so, it's funny being Filipino. I think everyone kind of assumes I'm a nurse, and yet I'm not. And I had to turn to so much of my community for information and advice, and really like leaning on the community to help me in deciding sort of the trajectory of what can I do with my dad. And it became glaringly clear to me that the American healthcare system feels really broken in many ways. And until I was in it, I had no idea. And so to me, I think of caregiving as all these different sort of ancillary topics that feels like there is no answer to supporting communities and individuals who will at some point be sick or vulnerable. And so I wanted to tell the story to shed light on it, to show how difficult it was to feel relatable to other people, because when I would be around with friends and family, I often wouldn't show that vulnerability, that feeling of, of fear and anxiety and, being scared all the time about whether my dad was going to go back into the hospital and the ICU and get sick again. And so to me, I just wanted to just share it from a really personal perspective. And so, yeah, for me, it was just trying to share that while also trying to balance is this ethical for my family? Is this okay for my family? I'm really scared about how people might perceive me and what they think about me. It's hard to watch myself in that. And also it was the first documentary short that I've ever directed. So on top of that, it was, feeling really vulnerable that I was showing all of this to the world. And so I do feel like after a year later, it's felt like it was a part of my healing process that I feel so proud that I can share this to the world and really show it as a love letter to my dad, even a year later. And so, I'd love to continue to use this as a way to show how difficult caregiving can be, how, parents out there who don't have the financial means or support, or, sandwich parents who are also having to manage having sick and aging parents as well, are struggling with this. And I really lean on the communities online that have really helped me in using their words of comfort to really be there at a time where I really didn't know where to turn to. And so I do know it ends up kind of working when people have reached out to me who have either been acquaintances or even friends who have said, I actually went through this myself, and this really does capture exactly what I went through, and I can't believe you put it out there. And so, yeah, I feel like that's kind of like where I've been feeling about caregiving and the future of it, and trying to push hopefully legislation and policy down the line so that we actually have universal health care and, care relief for folks who are getting burnt out from caregiving.
Thank you for sharing that, Frankie. And, it's a lot to unpack there. And really thank you for your vulnerability and just sharing, your struggles. But, one thing that you mentioned, you talked about how you leaned on your community. And I think especially during the pandemic, when, many of us were isolated and, all of you were creating these stories, there was, I feel like, a surge of, mental health resources available, or at least just the community leaning onto each other. And, if anyone wants to speak about, what were some of those resources that you were able to utilize, or where in your community did you, see an increase in mental health support?
Yeah, I could definitely start and mention that thank goodness for therapy, and also if it's needed, medication. At the time when it was 2016 when I first started caregiving, I felt a little bit of shame and weakness in wanting and asking for help and needing to talk to a therapist and go to a group therapy session, and at some point talking to a psychiatrist that how much I was struggling from anxiety, from severe depression and burnout. And at a time, my circle of friends and even other acquaintances either didn't understand, especially my family too, didn't understand it, didn't quite understand why I needed medication, didn't quite, relate to it. And so I feel really fortunate now to have, over the last few years, feel like we're at a time where we can talk about it, and there is less shame, less stigma around it, less a feeling of a weakness and more of a, oh no, everyone goes through this at some point in their life, and there's no shame in that. And so I felt like over the last few years, there's been a radical difference, particularly with COVID, that it is completely okay to feel these different feelings and feel these lows, and to turn to help. And so I've definitely felt that, coming out of the woodwork has been the community that actually goes through this. And the more we talk about it, the less shame, stigma, it comes out of that. And so I feel like finally talking about it more and more has made it, more accessible, more open. I see more nonprofit organizations. I mean, I know Carrie Zhang from the Asian Mental Health Project started in 2019. I've been so glad to see that they've been doing a ton. And for me, the Filipino community Search to Involve Filipino Americans has their own Mag-usap Mondays, where Filipinos can come together and actually talk and talk about the topics and themes that often come up in terms of like mental health. And so, yeah, I've been really proud to see like community organizations also coming out to really support all of us in the Asian American community.
Yeah, I would say like something I could offer is, during the pandemic shutdowns especially, I think it became really obvious that isolation is something that affects people's mental health. And it seems so obvious now, but I don't think it was a part of our kind of more mainstream discourse around how, not in addition to talk therapy, which I find very helpful for myself as well. I think something I struggle with, because so many of my family either only speak Vietnamese or only feel comfortable in Vietnamese, and that being a more limited resource, is that some people feel not great about articulating their feelings, but because there was kind of this thing that we were all going through together, we sort of looked for ways to be there for each other in ways that maybe is not always talking about feelings, but maybe also prompted us to talk about our feelings and call each other and things like that. So I think overall, the kind of awareness maybe increased around how things could affect people's mental health in the kind of daily way that we live our lives. And I think that has asked us as a society to maybe like step it up a little bit more.
I'll add, I think in Minneapolis, the mental health issue was obviously very big, because not only was there the pandemic, but there were the uprisings here. And a lot of people were constantly, in being traumatized or in crisis because of lack of access to food, or their experiences with police brutality or whatever. And it's kind of interesting because it was also simultaneously some degree of healing, because I think when George Floyd was murdered, I think it gave a platform for other families in the Twin Cities whose loved ones had been killed by police to come forward and have their stories heard a lot more. And so I think the community was able to come together in a way that was healing, but because the community was holding so much, there was a lot going on. So I remember during that period, I was getting like 2 to 4 hours of sleep a night, because it was a mixture of trying to manage the pandemic, trying to still make money and make a living, and then community crisis and all of that. And I know that a lot of the most active activists in the community across cultures it's taken several years for them to finally step back and focus on their mental health. And I think that in the past year or so, it's been a lot more of focus on mental health. And I know in my film, the two children in the family, they're adult children, but they have a conversation with their parents about mental health. And it was a conversation that they had never had with their parents before. And I think being in that situation where there was a mental health crisis, it gave an opening for them to talk about mental wellness. And so I think that in many ways, a lot of the terrible things have given openings for some positive things to happen as well.
I have a quick question for Frankie. I'm about to, so I lost my mom like 1.5 years ago, and I was about to start making a short film kind of around some of those experiences. And I was just wondering if you were to do it all again, like, would you have done anything differently, or what did you like kind of learn from this process of like something so private and life-changing to, sharing it so publicly?
Yeah, I definitely feel like it was really only possible because of how defiantly upset I was at the lack of resources and funding for caregivers, and knowing that parents go through this, but also for caring for an aging parent, there are really very little resources and financial means or grants to support you. And truthfully, I felt like it felt like a privilege in a way of like, oh, if only I'd made more money, if only I came from generational wealth, if only there was just like financial means that can give my dad a better quality of life towards the end of his life. That started to really upset me more than anything. On top of the fact that, you know, I had all this guilt and like trying to express that. So I look at it and I very much understand that the intention is to share by revealing myself in it. And I honestly, truly feel like it was the support of ADOC, Lailanie, and Pallavi, and my mentor, Sarah Kim, who everyone has understanding of caregiving and that feeling, and also, you know, being a big sister, being a mother, being a, you know, a daughter. There's something about that of like having the support system needed to help me also make this story. And so I very much have no regrets sharing it, but it was really difficult and it was really hard. And many times I just didn't want to share it because it's so personal and vulnerable. But I also very much commend folks for also, you know, sharing your family story as well. It's very much beautiful and a privilege for as an audience member to watch it.
Thank you for sharing that. And thanks for the question, JP. I think it was a really important question to ask. And, you know, how much our mental health is impacted by family and our identity. I wanted to go into our next topic to kind of dig a little bit deeper into this. And so I wanted to start off this topic with Joua Lee Grande's On All Fronts. So let's take a watch.
I watch the video that I think it can be my son, you know. It can be my son.
I really love this story because you get to see this family who they're 100% Black and 100% Asian. And it's not like they're pulled between these communities. They're all of these communities.
And continuing on this topic of how family has impacted, you know, our identity, and also mental health has taken a part on that. You know, Joua, I want to kind of ask you, you know, with your close relationship with the Moss family, because they were, you know, I felt like they were very vulnerable and safe with you when you were filming with them. And I wanted to ask, you know, how can we better support families who are biracial, especially in the Midwest, and kind of what you've seen, you know, as you were spending more time with the Moss family? Can you share more?
Yeah, I think I love the Moss family, one of my favorite families in the world. And I think something that we talked about in that conversation, and I think many of us probably experience, is that a lot of communities of color aren't yet talking about mental health, and there's still a lot of stigma and taboo about it. And so that's challenging, but I think that with younger generations shifting that and normalizing mental illness, I think it's changing a lot. And with the Moss family, that definitely was the first time they discussed it. And I think that it gave an opening that they hadn't had before. And I think that with family, it's just so important because someone is in this is the first of support. So a lot of the times you have to create safety plans, and that involves family, and having conversations about that is super important. Yeah, I'm so sorry if I forgot an element of your question.
Yeah, no, that's great. And, you know, part of also too, I wanted to ask as well is, you know, have you seen like an increase in conversation about, you know, biracial families? Because this is, you know, something. I was at the Asian American Studies conference recently, and, you know, this was a topic of conversation that I had with one of the professors. And do you see that increase in support for families?
Yeah, I think that it's a challenge, right? Because I think a lot of people still see like mixed race families as its own kind of bubble, which in some ways it is, because it is a very unique experience. But like people, when they are mixed race, they identify as fully each cultural identity. And I think that that's hard for some people to understand or accept. And I think that the way to support people is to entirely embrace their identities, 100% this and 100% that. And I do know that when the film showed, I had friends and strangers who were biracial, who had biracial families, who said like, well, this is the first time I've ever seen, like, I can see my family in this story. This is the first time I've seen that. And that was a little bit sad to hear, because you would hope that there would be more representations. And so I think that a really important way to support biracial and multiracial families is to allow for more opportunities to tell those experiences and those stories, and to really allow people to show up fully as who they are. And I think a lot of multiracial people get the experience of one community saying, oh, you're not entirely part of this community. And that's really heartbreaking to hear, because so I actually, my daughter is biracial, and so it informs a lot of what I think all the time about the conversations I want to have with her, the ways that I want family and community to treat her. And I know that I want her to feel like she has community everywhere she goes. So I think that that's something that a lot of people need to be more mindful of, and in terms of like how to interact with biracial people, to include them fully as part of the communities.
Thank you for sharing that. And I want to turn the question over to you, JP, too. And, you also come from a multi-racial family. And how has that affected, growing up, filmmaking, your storytelling? And can you share more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely been central to my identity. And yeah, I mean, I think throughout my life, I've oscillated between whether I identify more as Korean American or Asian American, or just as American. I think a lot of it has to do with perception as well. I look more Asian presenting, so people treat me as such, or at least, but I think an important thing to point out is that, like, something to, like, just to add to what Joe was saying, was that, like, it's not just one side that kind of others you, it's both sides, and it's like the people who you care about most, like not being fully accepted by one side or the other. I think it's harder when you're growing up and you're younger, especially in the context of like school and spending time around family, especially if you look differently, that, there's always, you're trying to find your identity and seeing where you fit in, and, who are your people. And, in the context of like American schools of, there's a certain white norm of, how, things are presented. And, if you bring different types of food or you look differently, you don't fit within that context. But then it's also very painful. I struggled with spending time with my like Korean speaking family, Korean Americans here in California, and, not being able to speak the language fluently, and kind of being treated differently as such. And then, it becomes another aspect when you travel internationally, is that, I'm not perceived as being a white American when I travel, like I'm thought of as Chinese or Asian in Latin American countries, in Asia, even in Korea. When I go to Korea, I'm not considered Korean, or I don't look Korean at all. No one would start speaking Korean to me. And, Korean family, treats me differently as well because of language barriers. But, there's goods and bads. Like I as, my identity is more firmly as American. I think I realized that, even though, technically I'm half Korean and half white, multiracial, that, if I do go to other countries, you realize if you kind of where you grow up is kind of a big part of your identity. And so, a half Korean, half white person growing up in Korea is probably going to identify more as Korean. I mean, that's just what my perception and experience has been. But, you know, there's also goods as well. You know, like my Korean grandmother was extremely strict and hard on my other, you know, cousins and things like that. And I got a little bit more of a pass at times, you know. So, you know, there's goods and bads. I've made my peace with it. Yeah, there's definitely a complexity of identity. I think the biggest thing is having more stories like what Joe made, you know, as in terms of validating, oh, there are other people out there who go through a similar experience to me or kind of don't fit this stereotypical norm that we see on TV, that they can have parents that look differently or kind of a unique experience. And it feels good when you see that.
Thank you for sharing that. And so I think even a topic of conversation, you know, sometimes it is hard to have those conversations about race, identity, and politics. And, you know, what I also wanted to ask, you know, maybe Wing is, what has helped you have hard conversations with your loved ones? And we can open it up to anyone else that wants to add after.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, tying it back to the last thing everyone was talking about, how your family informs your identity. I think for me, growing up as a queer person, there was implicit and explicit kind of things, discourse around like, if you're queer, that is because you're Americanized, it's because you're born in the States. If you're in the home country, you would have never turned out this way. And obviously that's a ridiculous assumption, but so much of my own understanding of my cultural identity came from my family, my blood family immediately. And as you get older, I think there are more opportunities to sort of make that identity for yourself. You sort of kind of sever your dependence on your blood family to tell you what it means to be of your culture. And so in many ways, I think queerness has saved me because it allowed me to look for different avenues to be more Vietnamese American. And in doing so, I think that has also given me kind of a political language and way of understanding that I can then sort of bring back to my family. I think sometimes I laugh because I wonder if my parents look at me and they're like, who is that? You know, like, who is this person who didn't really know Vietnamese and then went off into the world and became super Vietnamese and like now speaks Vietnamese to like people that they don't know. And, you know, and so I think a large part of it for me personally is the language development. And, you know, structurally, I think in the United States, that's hard because we don't value other languages that much. You know, it took me, I want to say like 6 years to even have the confidence to utter anything in Spanish. And I like took it all through high school, you know? And so, yeah, language. And then the other part of it that I think is a harder thing is to like play the long game with like race and identity. I think when I was younger, I felt the need, like if I articulated myself in Vietnamese really like well and straightforward, then no one would disagree with me. And I'll just like tell them about race and and politics, and everyone would agree with me because I'm so articulate. But I think, you know, as you get older, you realize that there's more to it than that. And it's not one conversation that changes the minds of people. It's an ongoing, hard conversation in which sometimes you lose, sometimes you win. And there's, I don't know, it's like lifelong. And it's kind of scary to think about it that way, but I think it's also good.
Yeah, I'll chime in. I feel like I'm surrounded by people who don't want to talk about race, like in my family. And everyone's like, we just want to have peace and not talk about politics or race or anything. And I'm like the one person who destroys everyone's peace because I'm like, let's talk about race and identity. And so like, I know my partner and I have a lot of conversations about this, obviously, because we're trying to be full about how we're raising our daughter and making sure that she can embrace all of her different identities. And it's very, it's a little bit complicated in that like traditional Hmong culture says that when a woman marries a man, she becomes whatever he and his family is. So in many ways, some people would probably consider me no longer Hmong because I've married outside of the culture. I'm now part of the Latino community. But like as a person who's growing up here and like still very active in my own Hmong community, it's like, well, how can that be true when I'm still very much Hmong and I can't change that about myself, you know? And we have also conversations about like, because my partner is from El Salvador and he identifies as Salvadoran and Latino, I've also been broaching the conversation of like, what about your indigenous identity? Because so many folks from Latin America are actually indigenous, and they've, through, you know, centuries of colonization, have been separated from that identity. And so we do talk about those things about like, hey, next time we go to El Salvador, can we try to explore the indigenous community and culture as well? But I do find that sometimes just a lot of people are open to having those conversations and have never had those conversations. And especially because we do have a mixed race child. And then my brother-in-law also has a mixed race child who's Lao Salvadoran. So I think that opens it up, and we can talk a little bit more about like identity and how do we celebrate all of our cultures. And it's always very interesting because, of course, when we're in the Hmong and Asian community, they're like, oh, that's our little Latina girl. Or like when we go to like in the Latin community or go to El Salvador, we're for sure, some of the relatives are probably going to refer to my daughter as Chinita, right? Which actually means Chinese, but because they don't have a word for Hmong, we just get called Chinita, which is kind of funny, but yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to hop in and talk about, I think when my dad had passed, there was that feeling of severe loss of this force in my life, my dad. But then on top of it, it's almost like you're like losing the memories that also come with it. And that was a really hard thing to grasp with. So even when I was writing my dad's eulogy, I was like, please let me remember all these memories. Let me like remember why I am the way I am. And if I have children, like what that could be passed down to, because I know that, you know, over time we are who we are, not through that individual like of who we are, but collectively also what's generationally passed. And I couldn't help but feel that loss also of who I was in those moments. And in the last year of grieving, it's been a loss of who am I, you know, who was my dad, who can I speak to so that I can collect these memories of my dad. And so I know that's been kind of this sort of quest to continue to talk about everybody who has passed and who, you know, is on the other side and our ancestors, and trying to document that as much as I can, like talking to my dad's brothers and sisters, talking to my mom and her siblings as well, and trying to capture so much of that so that I can tell these stories moving forward. And that very much also, you know, in talking about these memories, it almost like helps me understand who I am, how, you know, certain behaviors are generationally passed down, certain, you know, folklore and stories. And even though I don't consider myself religious, I have very spiritual, you know, traits about me that I feel like I can't disentangle, no matter, you know, if I call myself atheist or agnostic. And so there is something about that where telling our stories becomes so much more important to me, even moving forward now that I've lost my dad, is like, I'm trying now to, you know, hear more of other people's stories, listen to what others have experienced, and in understanding that, you understand yourself that much more. And so I know later next year, I'm going to the Philippines, and like, I am bringing a film crew so I can try to capture, you know, tell me about my dad when he was younger, tell me about my dad when, you know, he was in high school, tell me more about, you know, what did he love to eat, what did he like to do hobbies wise, because, you know, this person has passed, but I'm trying to have his story live on by capturing all of that. So that's what I think about when I think about identity.
Thanks for sharing that, Frankie. And actually, that's a perfect transition into our next topic, because, you know, family and culture are integral in our communities. So the next topic I wanted to talk about is documenting our stories and histories. And so let's watch In Living Memory by Quyên Nguyen-Le.
How do we mourn places that only exist in our memories?
There was always this gap between my parents and I. And now I can ask my parents questions that I didn't maybe have the courage to ask or didn't think to ask when I was younger. what's so important about filmmaking for me. It allowed me to, with my mom, recover some of our family history.
And so, Wayne, your mother's nail salon closed during the pandemic. And can you share more about why you wanted to share her story and ultimately your story?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I grew up in the nail salon, and I had always had really complex feelings around guilt, around like gender. And I always knew that it was probably somewhere I was going to return to make film, because I take from my own life in my work. And it was really the closure that prompted this like more, I feel, straightforward. It asked me to be more straightforward with what I was trying to say to others about it. And yeah, I mean, it was very sudden. It literally, I think my mom closed it in May, and things had started shutting down in like March, but she just couldn't pay the rent anymore. And around that time, I think things were starting to resources were starting to pop up for business owners. But I think she just made this decision so quickly. Maybe talked about it with other people, but certainly didn't talk about it to me. And I came home and she was just like, yeah, I thought about it, and it's closing this week. And I already actually handed the keys back yesterday. And that was sort of I don't know, I had an instinct that it was such a big part of our lives growing up, and it couldn't just end like that. And so I don't know. And then this series came up, and I was like, oh, okay, I think this will give me a chance to sort of formulate something that would fit, the Asian American stories of resilience, but like telling it in a way that honored kind of both the complexity of my mom's own story, but also understanding that the nail salon means so much for Vietnamese folks in the US, especially California, with most nail salons being owned and operated by Vietnamese people. I lost my train of thought, but ultimately my story. I did not want to be in the film. I thought it was unnecessary. I wanted to focus on my mom. But as we kept going, it felt like, okay, this is actually a film also about making a film. And it's also about me learning things that I didn't actually know, such as my mother's relationship to Baile, who she met in a nail salon. They literally like became chosen mother-daughter because of a nail salon, and that was something that I didn't know in my life. Like, I knew of this person's existence, but I thought she actually was my mom's friend's mother. I didn't even know that they were actually the ones that were close, and that Baile's daughter just became my mom's friend because her mom was friends with my mom, And I think it's like these small things that when there is already an existing story about what this should be about, like, for example, Vietnamese nail salon workers, there's a lot of kind of discourse already existing. We lose like the details. And making this film with my mom asked me to see these little details. Yeah, okay, I'll end it there.
Thanks for sharing that. And JP, actually, I want to go next to you. And you shared Chanton's story, and I think even in the beginning, it was a little, are you going to continue to get access to the story just because he's also, he was able to get released, and so what made you want to keep making sure that you're able to tell his story, and even capturing, the family reunion that you did, which I think to me, it felt like an accomplishment, or, wow, we really are so happy that he finally was able to reunite with his family. Can you share more?
Yeah, so I'm in the process of making a longer film about Chanthan as well as his best friend Tith, who was also they met in San Quentin and became best friends. And Tith is also Cambodian American, and also is slated. He has a court date with federal immigration to see whether he'll get deported or not. So the story is ongoing, and unfortunately, like, you know, the family, the 10-minute short that's on World Channel is like just a small slice of his experience after, you know, shortly getting released from a California state prison. You know, he had it's really happy to reunite with his family, but at the same time, he could be apprehended by ICE at any time currently, and that's still ongoing, and that's a threat that people who just don't have a certain type of paperwork in this country, unfortunately, are potentially faced with. And so, yeah, I mean, my motivation was just to continue to share these stories, especially from different folks, you know, that aren't necessarily featured in mainstream media so much. There's a wide variety of people who are affected in this way, unfortunately. And I'm making a film, another longer version of the film that kind of goes into more of the policy aspects and kind of questioning this norm in the United States that, you know, if you are an immigrant or a refugee and you commit a crime, there's the norm in this country that you should just be kicked out, that you should leave. And so I kind of question why that is the norm. I think anyone can relate to, you know, what happens when you kind of separate families, especially from you and your loved ones. And I question how much, you know, good that does to our society as a whole, especially after we've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars per year incarcerating people. And what good does that do to deport someone just because they don't have paperwork in this country? So, yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. And, you know, and it's really great that, you know, these shorts have the power, you know, to share diverse stories and, you know, with initiatives, you know, like this that we have at ADOC and even other opportunities to get shorts out there. You know, how important is it to document and share these stories, whether, you know, they're personal or they're of many other communities? And, you know, wanted to open it up to, say, the Frankie, if you wanted to share.
Yeah, I think certainly documenting and sharing our stories can give such an empathetic and compassionate view into what folks might be experiencing. I know for me, when doing recording for Dodi, I really wanted to be intentional that this was my point of view, that my dad and showing my dad, you know, at the end and reuniting with him, that was very intentional to share that this was a coming together of the two of us. But when I realized that I wanted to shed the light on my experience, because I can give, you know, consent to that. I could consent to the fact that this is what I am struggling with. This is the hardships that I'm going through, that, you know, that every facet of my life, from like work to family to friends, this was always in the foreground of my life, and that kind of mental struggle. You know, a lot of it was documented through writing, through therapy sessions that I asked to record, through trying to just also capture my dad's memory through a camera, and just trying to remember it as much as possible was really where I was getting a lot of my footage, truthfully. And so when getting accepted to this and having the opportunity to share this story, I realized that a lot of my content was about just me talking to myself about how hard this was. And so that felt like an opportunity to be vulnerable and share what I know other caregivers have told me in passing. And while I can understand and I'm not physically there, I wanted to kind of have some sort of like visual of like what the mental breakdowns look like on a day-to-day basis. and particularly when COVID, the height of COVID and the pandemic and all the lockdowns, I was reading so many articles about the fact that many families were separated, and you could only really bring your family in if you have the money or the financial means, and if they are, like my dad at the time, really need a lot of round-the-clock 24-hour care. You do not have that option. You do not have that privilege to then have your family with you during the worst time of, in my lifetime of being separated from families. And so I definitely wanted to show that this was what was happening, and the fact that this tends to happen all the time of like isolation and what that can do from a mental health, and from a mental health standpoint that actually affects our actual bodies. And so I do find it very important, and and I'm really excited the fact that we are able to share this and the nuances that kind of come with all of our different experiences, and the people that we've collaborated with as subjects.
Yeah, I want to add that I loved all of the films in the series, and I have so much love for all the filmmakers in the series. And I think that the series is really important because for so long here in America, we've been lumped into one group, right? And everyone just considers us as one culture. And I love that there's so many personal stories, and can get a really intimate look into how other families operate. And I know for me, for example, here in Minneapolis in the inner city, we have a lot of Hmong, Lao, and Viet folks, but East Asian folks don't actually live in the inner city. A lot of them live in the suburbs. So I didn't grow up with East Asian friends, and so I was always curious how they grew up and how it was different from my experience. And so I love that through these films, we can get a sneak peek into how people grew up and their family dynamics. And I also just want to say, like, personal docs are really hard. And so I have so much respect for those of you who chose to do stories about your own family. And I think JP and I are the only ones who didn't do a film about our own families here. But I'm super looking forward to JP, you doing your personal doc about your family, because I know since you mentioned you're interested in doing that. And I've been working on a feature-length film about myself and my family, and it's a lot. It's a lot. So that was a big reason why someone asked, like, why did you do a film about yourself? I'm like, no, I'm already doing a feature. It's way too much. But so I just want to commend everyone for like telling the stories of their own families.
Right, and it's getting down to the hour, and so I kind of want to leave just one last question to each of you before we close out. Is, with this series coming out on broadcast, and it's still continuing to be streamed online, what do you hope the audience can take away from your stories as they continue to live on?
I think I'll jump in first. Two things I'm thinking about is, one, that maybe kind of is across all our films, is to kind of honor the experiences and hardships that we went through. So I think it's very easy to kind of feel like, okay, well, now that's over, and now you're in a new chapter era of like life. But to kind of, I think that's what films, especially short ones, because they're like mini and they're not a lot of commitment, ask you to kind of have this portal into the past and to kind of think about it. And the second thing for me, and I think has been a theme in my own life, is to kind of not take generational memory for granted. So I come from a refugee family. Both my parents didn't grow up with parents, so their kind of like sense of self was formed by orphanhood. And so I only know what my parents know. And that is actually apparently very little compared to other people. And so kind of the practice of like passing on memories and sharing, I think, has become really intentional for me. And that's what I hope that people see in my film, of just the small ways you can sort of like remember things that don't exist anymore. But also for people who, even if they don't relate to the film directly, to kind of think about the ways they can honor the things that have happened in their lives and kind of pass it on instead of just kind of leaving it in the past.
I'll add on to that. I just because I just spoke to like a bunch of middle schoolers, this is fresh in my mind, but one thing that I always say to people who are aspiring filmmakers or who are interested in telling any story is that I think one of the most important stories to tell is your own story and your family story, especially if you're from a marginalized community, because those stories are missing. And I also feel like as creators, many of us probably are in this work because we want to see more of the experiences that are like ours out there for people to connect with. So I very much like, I think that it's really important that when folks are starting out, they consider telling their own story. So.
Okay, I'll go. I was kind of Frankie forgot the question. Yeah, I mean, just one thing I would like audience to take away is, you know, just the norm of deportation in this country, and to question whether, I guess, where, you know, people come from and how they came here. Many of our parents here as part of this panel, like, I think a lot of our parents came here because of American foreign intervention in other countries. You know, military involvement, you know, involved in destabilizing other countries. So, you know, I mean, to deport immigrants and refugees if they make mistakes or don't have the same opportunities as other Americans because we, you know, our military, you know, messed up their country in the first place is kind of this cruel irony that happens. And it might be something, you know, might be a little bit of an archaic sort of law and practice that maybe we need to rethink in the future.
Thank you also for writing the question. Yeah, in terms of what can we hope the audiences take away from our stories, I think I really appreciate that all the filmmakers had very, you know, compassionate, personalized stories that really understand the day-to-day living of what, you know, many of us are going through. And I hope that leads to impact, to actual changes of how we can actually support our communities, from, you know, what JP was just saying about like, right, deporting and incarcerating, you know, our communities, to the fact that, you know, small businesses were not being supported at a time where we were giving tax breaks and free money to millionaires and billionaires, but small businesses like didn't have the resources to, you know, caregiving and not having enough financial means and, you know, healthcare support for those who are sick, as well as supporting frontline workers. Certainly every one of our stories had so many different, you know, personalized stories that really have a bigger and larger impact. And so I really hope that this could lead to, you know, more legislative change, more policymakers, you know, using these stories as a way to drive that change, more community organizations to use it as a tool to, you know, mobilize people. That to me is also the power of telling our stories, is how can we make that change for generations after us so that they don't have to go through some of these really difficult experiences as well. So yeah, that's what I really hope for audiences take away from this.
Thank you, everyone. It's already the end of our conversation. And, you know, thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you to Frankie, Wing, Joua, JP, and everyone at World Channel who helped put this on. And so we hope these stories continue to resonate with each of you. And so we welcome you to follow the Asian American Documentary Network on social media at AA Network and visit us at a-doc.org. Also visit the Center for Asian American Media at caamedia.org and follow them on social media as well. And so all 7 shorts in the Asian American Stories of Resilience and Beyond are available to stream on worldchannel.org, on YouTube, and on the People app. And watch Volume 1 featuring and Frankie's films on Local USA on May 22, and Volume 2 featuring JP's film on May 29th. So be sure to subscribe to the World Channel newsletter and YouTube channel for more films and filmmaker interviews. So thank you, everyone.